As the 19th century turned into the 20th, while Chicago prepared to host the 1893 World's Fair, celebrating the progress and marvels of the modern age, a man weaved a web of horror and death that would rival the darkest Gothic fictions. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known by the pseudonym H.H. Holmes, emerged as an enigmatic and terrifying figure, embodying the dark side of the American dream. Born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, Holmes grew up in a respectable family, but early on showed a penchant for deceit and manipulation. His sharp intelligence and superficial charm masked a deep psychopathy that would manifest in a series of heinous crimes that would shock the nation. The main stage for Holmes's nefarious acts was the infamous Castle, a 3-story building he constructed in Englewood, then a suburban neighborhood of Chicago. This structure, ostensibly a hotel designed to accommodate visitors to the World's Fair, was in reality a macabre labyrinth of secret corridors, trapdoors, and torture chambers. It was here that Holmes lured his victims, primarily young women coming to the city seeking work and opportunity, to meet a terrible fate. Holmes's criminal career spanned elaborate frauds, bigamy, and most notoriously, a series of meticulously planned and executed murders. He used his medical training to strip and skeletonize the bodies of his victims, selling them to medical schools or disposing of them in ingenious ways that made their discovery difficult. The exact number of Holmes's victims remains uncertain to this day, with estimates ranging from 9 to over 200. His capture and subsequent trial in 1895 captivated public attention, with newspapers eager for every sordid detail of his crimes. Holmes's confession, published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, mixed truths, half-truths, and blatant lies, contributing to the mystery that continues to envelop his figure more than a century later. Early life and signs of disturbance. Herman Webster Mudgett, who would later adopt the infamous pseudonym H.H. Holmes Yoder, was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Son of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, Herman grew up in a devout Methodist family as the third of 4 children. Although his childhood appeared at first glance to be typical for rural New England standards of the 19th century, it soon became clear that there was something deeply disturbing about young Mudgett. From an early age, Herman demonstrated exceptional intelligence, outperforming his classmates and fascinating his teachers with his rapid learning and sharp reasoning abilities. However, this early intelligence came with a darker side. Accounts from his early years suggest that he had a morbid fascination with death and the dissection of animals. A particularly disturbing incident occurred when Herman was only 6 years old. One of his few childhood friends fell from an abandoned loft and died days later due to complications from the fall. Persistent rumors suggested that young Mudgett had something to do with the accident, although nothing was ever proven. This event, true or not, became part of the mythology surrounding Holmes, fueling speculation about the early onset of his homicidal tendencies. Adolescence and early signs of deceit. As Herman grew older, his behavior became increasingly erratic and manipulative. In school, he was known for his intelligence but also for his propensity to lie and deceive. His peers described him as solitary and strange, often avoiding his company due to his unpredictable behavior. A particularly disturbing aspect of his adolescence was his growing interest in medicine and anatomy. While many young people of the time might have had a healthy interest in these fields, Herman's fascination bordered on obsessive. He began collecting dead animals, secretly dissecting them, and keeping skeletons and organs as a macabre collection. By the age of 16, Herman secured a job as a teacher in a local school. It was during this period that he began to develop the charm and charisma that would later become his most dangerous tools. He was able to charm both students and parents, effectively masking his disturbed nature under a facade of respectability and intelligence. Early steps towards a life of crime. At 18, Herman married Clara Lovering, his first wife. The marriage was brief and tumultuous, with Herman frequently disappearing for long periods without explanation. During this time, he began getting involved in minor fraudulent schemes, using his charm and intelligence to deceive people and gain financial benefits. In 1882, at the age of 21, Mudgett enrolled at the University of Michigan's medical school. Here, his morbid fascination with human anatomy found an apparently legitimate outlet. However, even in this academic environment, Herman's criminal tendencies began to manifest more seriously. While in medical school, Mudgett was implicated in several insurance fraud schemes. He would steal cadavers from the anatomy lab, mutilate them to make them unrecognizable, and then use them to make false insurance claims. This was just the beginning of a criminal career that would soon escalate to unimaginable levels of depravity. This narrative delves into the life and crimes of H.H. Holmes, exploring not only the horrifying details of his acts, but also the social and historical context that allowed such a cunning predator to operate with impunity for so long. Through detailed accounts of his known victims, meticulous reconstructions of his methods, and analyses by criminology and history experts, we seek to understand the man behind the monster and the mechanisms of a mind that delighted in others' suffering. The transformation into H.H. Holmes. After graduating from medical school in 1884, Mudgett began using various aliases, the most notable being Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or simply H.H. Holmes. This name would become synonymous with terror and morbid fascination in the years to come. Holmes moved to Chicago in 1886, a rapidly growing city that offered countless opportunities for a man of his intelligence and lack of scruples. It was here, in the bustling streets and expanding neighborhoods of Chicago, that H.H. Holmes began to build his empire of horror, culminating in the construction of the infamous castle that would become the setting for his most heinous crimes. The story of H.H. Holmes is a disturbing journey from the apparent innocence of rural childhood to the extreme depravity of adulthood. It is a fascinating and terrible case study of how intelligence, when devoid of empathy and morality, can lead to acts of almost unimaginable evil. As we delve into the details of his crimes, we will see how young Herman Webster Mudgett transformed into the monster that history would know as H.H. Holmes, America's first documented serial killer. In 1886, H.H. Holmes arrived in Chicago, a city teeming with opportunities and transformations. The metropolis was preparing to host the 1893 World's Fair, and the constant influx of new residents and visitors created the perfect environment for a predator like Holmes to operate without raising suspicion. Holmes quickly found employment at a pharmacy in the Englewood neighborhood, then a prosperous suburb of Chicago. The owner, Dr. E.S. Holton, was in poor health, and his wife was eager to sell the business. Holmes, using his charm and intelligence, convinced Mrs. Holton to keep him on as manager. Shortly after, Dr. Holton died under mysterious circumstances, and Holmes manipulated the widow into selling him the pharmacy. With the acquisition of the pharmacy, Holmes began to establish his presence in Englewood. He became a respected figure in the community, known for his intelligence and affable manners. However, behind this facade of respectability, Holmes was already planning his most audacious crimes: the construction of the murder castle. In 1889, Holmes began construction on what would become his infamous castle, a three-story building located at 63rd and Wallace Street, across the street from his pharmacy. Ostensibly, the building was a hotel designed to accommodate visitors to the upcoming World's Fair. In reality, it was a meticulously designed death factory. Holmes personally oversaw every detail of the construction, frequently hiring and firing workers to ensure that no one fully understood the building's layout. The result was a labyrinthine structure filled with sinister peculiarities: hermetically sealed rooms that could be flooded with gas to asphyxiate occupants, staircases that led nowhere, and doors that opened onto brick walls, secret passages and trapdoors that allowed Holmes to observe and access rooms undetected, an elevator shaft designed to drop bodies directly into the basement, a torture chamber equipped with various instruments of torment, an improvised crematorium in the basement to dispose of bodies. The castle was a physical manifestation of Holmes' twisted mind. Each element was carefully planned to facilitate his crimes and hinder any attempt at escape or discovery by his victims. Holmes' modus operandi. With his castle completed, Holmes began to lure victims in large numbers. His modus operandi typically followed a pattern. He advertised attractive jobs, especially for young women arriving in Chicago in search of opportunities. He required applicants to have life insurance, often offering to pay the premiums himself, with him as the beneficiary. Once victims were settled in the hotel, Holmes seduced, robbed, or murdered them, depending on his specific goals. He used his medical knowledge to kill in ways that could pass for natural deaths. He dissected the bodies, selling skeletons and organs to medical schools, or incinerated them in the basement. The World's Fair and the peak of crimes. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, provided Holmes with an unprecedented opportunity. With thousands of visitors arriving in the city, many of them young women traveling alone for the first time, Holmes had a seemingly endless supply of potential victims. During this period, it is estimated that Holmes killed dozens, possibly hundreds of people. The transient nature of many fair visitors meant that disappearances often went unnoticed or were not thoroughly investigated. Holmes' castle, with its proximity to the fair and its facade of a respectable hotel, became a sinkhole for human lives, a monument to evil disguised as hospitality and opportunity. As we explore Holmes and specific crimes and the fates of his known victims, we will see how this man turned a moment of national celebration into an opportunity to perpetrate a series of murders on an industrial scale, establishing himself as one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in American history. Holmes' most well-known and documented victim was Julia Connor, an attractive 28-year-old woman. Julia Connor arrived in Chicago in 1891 with her 12-year-old daughter Pearl. Julia was married but separated from her husband and seeking a new life in the rapidly growing city. She found employment at Holmes' pharmacy, where she quickly became a target of his manipulative charm. Holmes, in using his seduction skills, began a love affair with Julia. He convinced her to move into one of the apartments in his castle, promising her a life of comfort and security. Julia, dazzled by Holmes' intelligence and charisma, readily accepted, bringing young Pearl with her. At first, life in the castle seemed idyllic for Julia and Pearl. Holmes treated them well, providing material comfort and attention. However, as months passed, Julia began to suspect that Holmes was not the man he claimed to be. She discovered he was married and involved with other women in the building. Confronted by Julia, Holmes reacted with calculated coldness. In December 1891, he convinced Julia to undergo an abortion, claiming she had become pregnant during their affair. In reality, there is no evidence that Julia was pregnant. The procedure was performed by Holmes in one of the secret rooms of the castle. Julia Connor never recovered from this abortion. She died a few days later, supposedly due to complications from the procedure. In reality, it is believed that Holmes murdered her, possibly using chloroform or some other method that could pass for natural death. Pearl Connor's fate is even more tragic. After her mother's death, the 12-year-old girl was completely at Holmes' mercy. Reports suggest he may have sexually abused her before finally murdering her. Pearl's body was never found, but it is believed Holmes used his improvised crematorium in the basement to dispose of the remains. An autopsy was never performed on Julia's or Pearl's bodies, as Holmes managed to avoid any official investigation. He claimed that Julia had moved out of town with her daughter, and his story was accepted without question by local authorities. The case of Julia and Pearl Connor perfectly illustrates Holmes' modus operandi, seduction, manipulation, and finally, cold and calculated murder. It also highlights how he was able to operate with impunity, discarding human lives without raising suspicions from authorities or the local community. This case was one of the first to come to light during subsequent investigations into Holmes, and helped establish the pattern of his crimes. The story of Julia and Pearl Connor continues to haunt those who study the H.H. Holmes case, serving as a grim reminder of the vulnerability of women and children in society at the time, and the ability of a skilled predator to exploit that vulnerability for his own nefarious ends. Another victim of the killer was Emmeline Sigrand, an attractive and intelligent 24-year-old woman who arrived in Chicago in 1892 from Indiana. She was a skilled stenographer, seeking job opportunities in the growing city. Emmeline quickly caught Holmes' attention, who hired her as his personal secretary. Physical description: Emmeline was described as a beautiful woman of average height, with brown hair and piercing blue eyes. She had a vivacious personality and was known for her intelligence and professional skills. The fatal encounter, Holmes, using his usual charm, began courting Emmeline. He invited her to live in his castle, offering her a comfortable apartment and the promise of a bright future together. Emmeline, impressed by Holmes' apparent sophistication and intelligence, accepted the offer. In the following months, Holmes skillfully manipulated Emmeline, gradually isolating her from her family and friends. He convinced her to break off her previous engagement, promising her marriage. As part of his plan, Holmes persuaded Emmeline to take out substantial life insurance, naming him as the beneficiary. The disappearance. In December 1892, Emmeline Cigrand suddenly disappeared. Holmes informed everyone that she had married a wealthy man and moved to Europe. In reality, it is believed that he murdered her in one of his specially designed rooms in the castle. Crime reports. Although the exact details of Emmeline's murder remain uncertain, circumstantial evidence and Holmes' later confessions suggest a terrible end. It is believed that he lured her into one of his hermetically sealed rooms, possibly with the promise of a romantic surprise. Once inside, Holmes allegedly sealed the room and released gas, asphyxiating Emmeline. After her death, Holmes likely used the secret elevator to transport Emmeline's body to the basement, where he performed his macabre dissections. Infelizmente, nenhuma autópsia formal foi realizada no corpo de Emmeline Cigrand, pois seus restos mortais nunca foram recuperados. No entanto, durante as investigações posteriores, foram encontrados no ex-castelo fragmentos de ossos e dentes que podem ter pertencido a ela. Holmes mais tarde confessou ter vendido o esqueleto de Emmeline para uma escola médica. Esta prática de vender restos humanos para instituições médicas era comum em sua operação criminosa, aproveitando-se de sua formação médica e dos contatos que havia feito durante seus anos na faculdade de medicina. O caso de Emmeline Cigrand é particularmente perturbador porque ilustra a extensão do planejamento e manipulação de Holmes. Ele não apenas assassinou Emmeline, mas efetivamente apagou sua existência, criando uma história elaborada sobre seu suposto casamento e mudança para a Europa. Esta habilidade de Holmes em criar narrativas convincentes para encobrir seus crimes foi fundamental para sua capacidade de operar impunemente por tanto tempo. O desaparecimento de Emmeline também destaca como as estruturas sociais da época tornavam as mulheres particularmente vulneráveis a predadores como Holmes. A facilidade com que ele pôde isolar Emmeline de sua rede de apoio e manipular sua vida financeira sem levantar suspeitas é um testemunho sombrio das limitações enfrentadas pelas mulheres na sociedade do final do século XIX. O caso de Emmeline Cigrand permanece como um dos mais emblemáticos na série de crimes de H.H. Holmes, servindo como um lembrete assustador de sua crueldade calculista e da vulnerabilidade de suas vítimas. The death of the next victim played a fundamental role in bringing his heinous crimes to light. Benjamin Petzel, unlike many of Holmes' victims, was not a young woman, but a 38-year-old man with a family. Petzel was a skilled inventor and carpenter whom Holmes met in 1889 and soon became his accomplice in various fraudulent schemes. Physical description: Benjamin Petzel was described as a tall, thin man with dark hair and a prominent mustache. He had tired eyes and an often melancholic expression, reflecting his struggle with alcoholism and financial difficulties. The fatal encounter. The relationship between Holmes and Petzel was complex. Holmes saw in Petzel a useful partner for his schemes, taking advantage of his carpentry skills and desperate financial situation. Petzel, in turn, saw Holmes as a way out of his economic problems. In 1894, Holmes convinced Petzel to participate in an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. The plan was for Pitezel to fake his own death, and Holmes would help his family collect the $10,000 insurance payout, a considerable sum at the time. Pitezel, desperate for money to support his wife and 5 children, reluctantly agreed. What Pitezel didn't know was that Holmes planned to actually murder him. On September 2, 1894, in a rented office in Philadelphia, Holmes killed Pitezel, probably using chloroform to render him unconscious before setting the body on fire. Holmes then manipulated the crime scene to make it appear that Pitezel had died in an accidental explosion during a chemical experiment. He placed a bottle of explosive chemicals near the body and arranged the remains in a way that made identification difficult. Autopsy result. The initial autopsy of Pitezel's body was inconclusive due to the severely burned state of the remains. However, the coroner noted that there were no signs that Pitezel had inhaled smoke, suggesting he was already dead before the fire started. Months later, when authorities began to suspect Holmes, a second, more thorough autopsy was performed. This revealed traces of chloroform in the remaining tissues, confirming that Pitezel had been murdered before his body was burned. The case of Benjamin Pitezel becomes even more tragic when we consider the fate of his family. After the murder, Holmes convinced Pitezel's wife, Carrie, that her husband was still alive and in hiding. He then persuaded Carrie to leave 3 of her 5 children, Alice and Nellie and Howard, in his care, promising to take them to reunite with their father. In reality, Holmes took the children on a macabre journey through several cities, eventually murdering them one by one. Alice and Nellie were killed in Toronto, their bodies found buried in the cellar of a house Holmes had rented. Young Howard was murdered, and his remains were discovered in Irvington, Indiana. The murder of Benjamin Pitezel and the subsequent murder of his children marked the beginning of the end for H.H. Holmes. The investigation into insurance fraud led authorities to discover Holmes' true identity and unravel his web of lies and crimes. This case is particularly disturbing because it demonstrates the coldness with which Holmes was capable of betraying even those closest to him. It also illustrates the extent of his cruelty, not only in killing Pitezel but in prolonging his family's suffering through a series of elaborate deceptions. The murder of Pitezel and his children would be crucial in Holmes' trial, providing concrete evidence of his crimes and helping to ensure his conviction. This case, more than any other, exposed H.H. Holmes' true nature to the world, revealing him not just as a cunning fraudster, but as a ruthless and remorseless serial killer. The day H.H. Holmes' crimes began to come to light was a gradual process, culminating in his capture on November 17, 1894. However, the unfolding of events that led to his downfall began months earlier, with the investigation into Benjamin Pitezel's murder. In September 1894, Philadelphia authorities began investigating Pitezel's suspicious death, initially believing it to be an insurance fraud case. Marion Hedgepeth, a former cellmate of Holmes, had informed the police about the fraud scheme, triggering a deeper investigation. Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police was assigned to the case and soon began to suspect there was much more behind the alleged fraud. As Geyer followed Holmes' trail through various cities, a web of lies and deception began to unravel. The detective discovered that Holmes had traveled with 3 of Pitezel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under false pretenses. The search for these children became the main focus of the investigation, leading Geyer on a macabre journey through several cities in the United States and Canada. In July 1895, the investigation took a dramatic turn when the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel were discovered buried in the cellar of a house in Toronto that Holmes had rented. This shocking discovery transformed what was initially a fraud investigation into a serial murder case. Authorities now had concrete evidence of Holmes' heinous crimes, and the search for him intensified. News of the discovery of the Pitezel girls' bodies spread quickly, causing a public uproar. Newspapers across the country published sensational headlines about the Toronto Monster and the Chicago Child Killer. The public was horrified by the idea that a man could commit such terrible acts against innocent children. Meanwhile, in Chicago, authorities began to investigate Holmes' infamous castle more closely. The building, which for years had been the scene of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths, was now under intense scrutiny. Neighbors and former tenants were questioned, revealing disturbing stories about strange sounds, inexplicable odors, and Holmes' eccentric behavior. On November 17, 1894, the hunt for Holmes came to an end when he was finally captured in Boston. His arrest was the result of a coordinated effort between police forces in several cities, with Detective Geyer playing a crucial role. Holmes was found living under a false name and attempting to implement another fraud scheme. When confronted, he initially denied his true identity, but was soon forced to admit who he really was. Holmes' capture triggered a wave of additional investigations. Forensic teams invaded the castle in Chicago, discovering horrifying evidence of his crimes. The building's basement revealed itself to be a chamber of horrors, with torture instruments, human remains, and the infamous makeshift crematorium where Holmes disposed of his victims' bodies. As more details of his crimes came to light, the public became increasingly horrified. Holmes had operated for years, killing dozens, possibly hundreds of people, without being detected. His capture exposed glaring flaws in the criminal justice system of the time and raised disturbing questions about how such a prolific predator could operate with impunity for so long. In the months following his capture, while awaiting trial, Holmes became a media sensation.